Yeah. Okay. All right. So today's topic is moral panics.
Moral panics.
Yes. So let's talk about what that is. It was actually a term that was first described and popularized by a guy named Stanley Cohen. He published a book back in 1972, a long while ago, called Folk Devils and Moral Panics. And the term was actually coined by one of his colleagues, but that's another story. So let's talk about a little bit, what's a folk devil? Well, the folk devil is a category of people who pose some perceived threat to society at large. And they're usually cast as outsiders or deviants. And usually the threat is not an actual physical threat, but it's more of a threat to societal norms or a perceived threat to social order or morality. And
social order, especially that happens to favor people who are in power to create moral panics.
Exactly. And the moral panic itself is this widespread and often disproportionate reaction to this threat that's posed by the folk devils. And so who gets to be a folk devil? Well, atheists are often folk devils. But in this case, we've just... something's falling back there. Oh, interesting. In this case, we've just seen a moral panic recently with the Proposition 8 and the Arkansas adoption debacle. So, of course, gays are often cast as folk devils. Historically, we've had a number of other groups cast as folk devils, including Jews during pre-World War II Germany and throughout World War II. Let's see, drug abusers are often cast as folk devils.
Reefer madness.
Indeed. In fact, that was one of those things I was going to bring up.
Sorry, don't want to step on the topic.
It's great. If you've never seen a little film called Reefer Madness, this is just a classic of, how to amplify a drug problem to just absurd levels. One hit off a doobie and you're done, man.
Right. What's great about Reefer Madness is, of course, that it's now a cult classic among drug users.
Or even people who don't use drugs, and,
right.
See how people can react over nothing. Interestingly enough, Prohibition was probably the result of a moral panic. This idea that, alcohol posed such a threat to social order that we had to ban it. And, of course, that didn't work at all. Another interesting thing is that one of the proposals for bringing us out of our current economic mess involves the suggestion that maybe we should legalize certain drugs because that would provide something like a $75 billion boost to the economy. So I'm sure that there will be a moral panic over that if we try that. So what are the elements of a moral panic? Well, the first thing is media of some kind. You've got to have some vehicle for hyping this. And these days, that doesn't have to actually be the mainstream media. Most of the people who promote these moral panics, who, by the way, we're going to call those moral entrepreneurs, and I'll get to who those people are in a minute. But the moral entrepreneurs out there who are out there promoting the moral panics, they typically have their own alternative sources of media these days, often called things like World Net Daily, as an example. In some cases, Fox News.
By saying moral entrepreneurs, do you mean to imply that they're making a profit off of this?
No, actually. Let me go ahead and get to those because I want to talk about those for a minute. But let's go ahead and talk about who these people are. The moral entrepreneurs, I categorize them as the do-gooders who are going to keep us all from going to hell in a handbasket. Because they have, in mind what's the right thing to do and what will restore social order or maintain it, and that's their goal. They're going to get people to adopt or maintain some kind of social norm, usually something that corresponds to, in certain cases, their religious beliefs. So they typically form some kind of action group to promote this agenda. And in fact, one of the key indicators that a moral panic is underway is the speed with which these action groups form. So if you see these groups forming practically overnight, you can almost bet that a moral panic is in the offing. And there are actually two types of moral entrepreneurs that we typically deal with. There are the rule creators, and these are people who, they're kind of moral crusaders, and they're not really concerned with whether the means to the end are necessarily ethical, or whether the facts they put out there are even actual facts. A lot of times it's just fiction. And then, of course, we've got the rule enforcers, and these people are often motivated by a need for respect or a need to justify their own role in society. And they're often pretty pessimistic about human nature. Now, again, we see this a lot with certain religious ideologies that promote the idea that we're inherently evil. Mm-hmm. And therefore we're in need of someone to enforce social order. And, of course, their God has the ultimate moral code. So,
well, large part of what religion is about, when you come down to it, is divisiveness. I mean, tribalism.
Yeah, and these people are really good at dividing us into us and them. And again, the going back to the media thing, there's this hype cycle that happens, and actually Cohen described it as the deviancy amplification spiral. And it was basically, there was this concern, it's this awareness that some behavior of the group or something in question might have a negative impact on society. And for example, in the Prop 8 thing, you know, one of the things is they could no longer generate enough outrage among people that, you know, gay people getting married was somehow going to impact heterosexual marriage. So they kept that, but they added on the fact that, oh, if we have gay marriage, then your child is going to hear about gay marriage in kindergarten. As if that would be a bad thing. And then, of course, there's this generation of hostility toward the group they've identified as the folk devils. And then, you know, then there's that clear division between them and us. And then after that, they go about seeking consensus. And it doesn't even have to be nationwide consensus. They typically will go toward, look toward people who share their own particular ideology, especially with regard to something like the institution of marriage. So you've got religious groups that turn to other conservative religious groups for validation of their concerns. And then, of course, there's an element of disproportionality to the panic. The fears are wildly out of proportion to what will actually take place. And, of course, in the Prop 8 thing and also the Arkansas anti-gay adoption ban, or the gay adoption ban in Arkansas, they hyped the perceived threat to children. So they were using children as a means of getting people to support this, even though the threat to children was non-existent in both cases.
I heard a discussion with a person shortly before the election who was pushing for Prop 8, and the host was not sympathetic to her, but he was saying, "Can you tell me exactly what the problem is with allowing gay marriage?" And she said, "Oh, well, we're not about keeping them from getting married. We're about preserving traditional marriage."
Yeah.
I was just frustrated that the guy did not follow up and say, "How so? You know, what the hell threat? What specific threat to traditional marriage does letting gay marriage cause?" I mean, all this person could say over and over again was, "It's changing the definition of marriage." Oh no!
Yeah.
We could change the definition of a word. Like, that never happens.
Yeah, and never mind that we've changed the definition of marriage, we've changed the definitions of family structures, and a lot of what people perceive as being the traditional family structure was actually kind of a myth. This whole Ozzie and Harriet thing, that was TV. And there's actually a woman named Stephanie, I think her name is Stephanie Kuntz, who has written a bunch of books. One of them that's pretty good is called The Way We Never Were. And it was about family structures and this idealized notion of what a family is like and how that really never was the case. So that's worth a read if you are interested in how we've actually changed how we define
it's
things
worth
over the
reminding
years.
people frequently that in the in the Old Testament, polygamy, like lots of polygamy, was not just permitted but condoned.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the great heroes of the Bible had like dozens or hundreds of wives.
Yeah.
Solomon.
Yeah. Yes. And
So there's traditional marriage for you, which makes it especially ironic when people say, "Oh, if you if you let gay people get married, that's just the first step in the slippery slope to allowing polygamy." Oh yeah, like in the Bible.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's why some of the biggest supporters of Prop 8 were from Utah. Yeah.
Yeah, don't they have some religious
like-
thing about some marriage thing?
Yeah.
Can't put my finger on it.
And that is actually a fact. Most of the out-of-state money that supported Proposition 8 came from Utah. And, there's, I think if you're not a Mormon in Utah, you're automatically a folk devil or something, because, almost everyone is.
When there's different groups that like to demonize different people, my favorite thing to do is pit them against each other.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I mean, I love nothing more than to see like a moderate Christian and a very conservative, or like a very conservative Christian and a very conservative Jew getting along with each other on TV, and then saying like, so do you believe that Jesus is your personal savior, Jew?
Yeah.
Jewish person?
Yeah. Okay. So getting back to some of the elements of a moral panic here, one of the key elements here is the interaction of government agencies, or I should say official agencies that get involved in this. And an example here is like law enforcement. So in the case of like drug abusers, you get law enforcement. You got to be tough on crime, and that usually involves having really draconian drug penalties, for example. In the case of some types of moral panics, child welfare agencies get involved. One of the big moral panics of our time was, I think it was back in the, was it the 80s when the McMartin preschool, the sex abuse scandal came out?
I don't know about that.
Yeah, there was a scandal that involved a preschool in California. I believe this was back in the 80s. The McMartin preschool, where a bunch of kids came forward and accused these teachers of having sexually molested them. And this mushroomed into this satanic ritual abuse claim. And so this thing spread like a panic all over the place. And there were people who were accused of ritually abusing children, murdering infants, things like that. And of course, when police investigated this, there was never any physical evidence that this was actually going on. But people absolutely believed it. And because of the interview techniques that some of the social workers and law enforcement agencies used against these children, the children ended up telling these very fanciful tales that involved, some really horrific instances of abuse. Unfortunately, for the people involved, a lot of innocent people were sent to prison. And in fact, there's still a guy in prison in California who was convicted of molesting his son, even though his son has long since recanted and said that never happened. I just believed that if I didn't say what they wanted me to say, that I wouldn't ever be allowed to go home.
That's terrible.
Yeah, so he's still sitting in prison because in every other case, there were several other people convicted in that particular case, but there was always some kind of flaw in the prosecution's case, and they were able to uncover it. For example, one of the girls who said that her father molested her, they came up with a physical examination where the nurse that examined her said there's no evidence of sexual abuse. And so that was one of the things that was used to help free her father.
Yeah, I've also heard a lot about so-called repressed memories. Yeah, does that tie into this?
Yeah, that's connected because
yeah, there are a lot of cases. You can read about this on the Skeptics Dictionary. They have a pretty good article about it there, where there are a lot of cases where people, under basically what would be known as leading the witness in court, psychiatrists would give people leading questions, which would lead people to think, oh yeah, I do remember something like my father coming in when I was asleep at night. And then and then so having a lot of cases where they just don't, they claim not to have remembered until it was drawn out of them that there was molestation by people who are ultimately innocent.
Yes. Yeah. And in the case of young children, they're particularly suggestible.
Right.
So you have to be careful how, and of course now, as a result of all this, we have interview techniques that are pretty good at interviewing children, but not foolproof. And then, of course, so child welfare agencies sometimes get involved in this. Even other agencies like professional associations can sometimes get involved in this. In some cases, they're not actually professional associations, but they are like pseudo-professional organizations. And one of the favored tactics of some of these people involved in anti-gay research and stuff like that is that they set up some kind of institute for researching this problem. And then, of course, they come up with their own view of what is essentially an ideological divide. They put this out there as legitimate social research, and of course it's not. One of the major offenders in this is a guy named Paul Cameron. I'm going to talk a little bit about him because he's actually where a lot of this so-called data on how gay people in particular are not appropriate as parents or are foster parents. That factored heavily into the Arkansas adoption bill. He's actually the originator of a lot of this research. And it was methodologically unsound, and I'll talk to him in a minute, but I want to get through the elements of the moral panic. The last thing that is involved here is politicians and legislators. Politicians rise to the occasion and say, oh, well, we'll pass a law. And the legislators, of course, hop on the bandwagon and fight over who's going to write the law and who's going to vote for it and stuff like that. So, what's a good moral panic without a politician in the mix? So
it's good political theater.
Absolutely. And that's one of the best ways to describe it is political theater. So those are the elements of a moral panic. Media, public perceptions, the public perceives this brewing threat. You've got government agencies, politicians and legislators, and of course the moral entrepreneurs who are sort of directing things behind the scenes.
Right. It seems to me a good person to level a moral panic against is somebody that people already don't trust, but also don't actually have very much power themselves. Because if they have a certain level of actual power, then they could fight it and be a dangerous opponent. But if you go after, what comes to mind is Dungeons and Dragons players,
right?
Which was also a big thing during the 80s, right? I mean, there's no good organized Dungeons and Dragons coalition there. So I mean, who's going to hear the other side if you've got people yelling about D&D destroying our children? Or
rock music. For a while, among religious circles, there was this whole idea about backmasked rock music. That if you play your music backwards, that you're going to hear satanic messages.
Did you know that Weird Al actually did that?
Yeah.
You did? Okay.
Yeah. Well, and when
I like to actually mention on the song "Nature Trail to Hell," Weird Al plays this scene, plays this clip that's obviously backwards stuff, and it's easy to turn records around now because of digital technology. And backwards it says, "Satan eats cheese whiz."
Well, and of course, Santa is an anagram for Satan.
Oh, of course, yeah. I doubt that was as intentional.
Yeah. So
Sinterklaas doesn't really work as well.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got all of our elements here, and I want to hit the media thing again one more time because historically the requirement was mainstream media picked up on something, and they could influence public perceptions by selectively reporting events. For example, back in the 80s, they were reporting lots of like drug overdoses and things, and so people's perception by like around 1989 was that drug abuse was like the biggest threat our country faced, even though it absolutely wasn't. But that was his public perception. Drug abuse actually hadn't increased. I think it was actually on the decline by then. Same thing with, recently Oprah Winfrey had a show on about these so-called rainbow parties where young girls were having sex at these parties and everything. It turns out that was an urban legend.
Right.
Urban legends are another big source of moral panics. And of course there's also, the internet, blogging, whatever. And unfortunately, with some of these alternative news sources, they claim that, the mainstream media won't touch this because it's politically incorrect. But in fact, a lot of times it's just incorrect. And that's why the mainstream media is not touching it. So, you have a case of either non-journalists out there reporting sensationalist hype or just shoddy journalism that reinforces a lot of this stuff. So the public can often end up with a skewed proportion or a skewed perception of what the biggest threat is out there. For example, in the 90s and even into this century or this decade, you would probably have believed that maybe school shootings were a significant threat.
Yeah.
And in fact, they're not any more likely than they were.
Well, I kind of have
that.
a theory about the way the internet and cable news has changed the way people perceive danger, because our brains are sort of geared to assess local probabilities.
Right.
So if we hear, for instance, that 3 children got molested or got, let's say, kidnapped in our tribe, I mean, within a 10-mile radius,
right.
within the last month, we would rightly panic. We would say, oh my gosh, there is a kidnapping epidemic.
Right.
On the other hand, everything international is now local.
Right.
So you can tune in on the internet, and everybody who gets kidnapped, especially if it's an attractive young blonde female, everybody who gets kidnapped is now national news. And so you can turn on the TV, you can follow them week by week, and then you can hear, oh my God, another attractive young blonde female just got kidnapped right after the last one.
Yeah.
And it's like, one was in Wisconsin and one was in California.
Yeah.
But they all seem local to us now, and so because we're bad at doing probabilities, we think there's this huge epidemic, which we didn't think so much when the news wasn't so when the news was more local.
Right. Well, that and it's one of those things that I forget who it was that coined the term, the boiled frog syndrome. It's the whole notion that if you take a frog and you put him in a pot of lukewarm water and you slowly raise the temperature, he'll sit there until he boils.
Right.
But if you drop a frog into hot water, he'll immediately hop out because he perceives the threat. And we are evolutionary.
Am I going to have to call you on another urban legend?
Well, it's just an analogy.
I just want to make sure people don't think Jen really believes that, because
no,
in fact, when you do the experiment, the frog jumps out of the slowly turned up water.
Yeah, they actually do. But it's just an analogy. But it's called the boiled frog syndrome. It's the idea that evolution sort of wired us to react to an immediate perceived threat, but the more gradual threats we just don't really react to until suddenly it's like, holy cow, I'm about to get eaten or something, And so because of this, we'll look at news reports of drug addiction or, young blonde females getting kidnapped, and we'll think that's the single biggest threat we face. And we'll ignore things like, the economic indicators are starting to turn down, and maybe we need to make some adjustments.
Right, like 9/11.
Yeah.
3,000 or 6,000 people died on that day, which is very tragic. But a lot more people than that die in car accidents or of obesity. So, if you have to figure out what to funnel resources into, anti-terrorism stuff is surely one important priority, and it's one of the sexiest ones, but it's not, but you might actually save more lives if you put more energy into something else.
Yeah, like everybody getting a flu shot every year, because, in a bad year, deaths from flu can equal a 9/11 like once a month. So, So anyway, let's. I want to go ahead and wrap this up real quick because it looks like we have full phone lines here, and
Okay.
one of them's out of state. So,
How about this? I'm going to take the out-of-state call every third caller. So
Okay.
first two people will be local.
you want to go ahead and take this because he's been on hold for about 15 minutes here.
Can I?
so.
I'm going